Twice in history, the city was breached. Not only was it a self-sufficient church or city, it was also a self-confident city, built upon this rock, only one road into the city, surrounded on three sides by sheer cliffs. People who lived in Sardis, they thought they were safe, or so they thought. And yet twice in history, the city was breached. And each time it was taken by the enemy, it was taken in exactly the same way. This is very interesting. It was taken in exactly the same way in both times. The first time was when Cyrus II, or Cyrus the Great as he was called, he surrounded the city. And they were besieged. Just imagine, can you remember how Masada in Israel was surrounded by the Roman legions? Well, Cyrus surrounded the whole entire city of Sardis. It was a strategic city. And he surrounded it. But it was impregnable. They were up in this walls around the city. The men of war in Sardis had a great advantage point. And there was no way that they could get into the city. It was impossible. And one day, there was many centuries around the east of the city where the main road came into the city, but round the north, the south, and the west, there weren't too many centuries. There were centuries, of course, but there was no way that an army could climb up these sheer rock cliffs without having some serious damage. And one day, one of the sentries bent down to look over, and his helmet fell off. And his helmet rolled down into a ravine halfway down the mountain. He went down to get his helmet. And the men, or the enemy at the bottom, the Persian enemy, they saw what had happened. And they watched him go down. And they watched him go back up again. And they said to themselves, there must be a way into the city, a pathway that we don't know. And that night, they went up to discover the pathway. And that was the way that they broke into the city and ransacked it and destroyed it. 300 years later, exactly the same thing happened. But this time it was Alexander the Great who was surrounding the city. And exactly the same thing happened. And they watched from the bottom and saw that there was a hidden pathway, and that's where Alexander's army went in and took the city. It's an amazing thing, isn't it, that Sardis had a history twice that they failed to watch. So you can imagine when this letter from the risen Christ comes to the church in Sardis, it must have had as much effect as the earthquake that shook the city and shook the church. Because they were self-confident, they were secure. And Jesus says to this church in Sardis, if you do not wake up, I will come like a thief, and you will not know what time I will come to you. If you do not watch, if you don't wake up, they were obviously, when you live in a place, you get to know a little about the history of the place, don't you? They knew what their history was. So they knew that the city had been taken because of they weren't watchful. And now the risen Christ speaks to them. They were not only self-sufficient and self-confident, they were self-indulgent. The people who lived in Sardis, they lived in an affluent society. And many believers in the church there had taken on the culture of the city. They were at ease in Sardis. And the Christians who lived there, it was apparent that they were at ease. Their Christianity was just, there was no effect in it. They were just at ease. They were taking their ease. The Bible says a little slumber, a little sleep, a little folding of the hands to sleep, so will your poverty come, like an armed man coming upon you. Here in Sardis, the church was asleep. The people in the city lived for pleasure, they lived for leisure, and that had soaked into the church, crept into the church, and lulled the church to sleep.